What's up, guys? Today you're going to learn how to deploy a Spring Boot War application to Tomcat inside a Docker container. So what we're going to cover in this tutorial is how to actually build that Spring Boot web application, deploy it on a remote Tomcat server instead of an embedded Tomcat server. And we're going to be doing this within the Netbeans IDE by using the Maven Spotify plugin, which is very simplistic in the sense that all it really does is it's going to build the Docker image for us. And there are other Maven plugins out there. I want to use this one for this tutorial because it serves its purpose. In subsequent tutorials, which we're going to start hitting more the cloud, okay, going and interacting with Git Online and Jenkins and all that kind of stuff, we're going to be using the Fabricate plugin to do that. But for this case, for this tutorial, it's perfectly fine to use the Spotify plugin. So if you follow my series, you'll be able to cover a couple of plugins there that are pretty popular out there. Now, Spotify can actually build a Dockerfile for you, but we don't want that. It's not a best practice to do that. We really want our own Dockerfile to be part of our project so anybody can just pull it and build that container if they would like to. So the Dockerfile I'm going to use is actually in here, and I'm going to be covering all of these lines here. There's no worries, you're not going to be lost. And then as a bonus, I'm going to show you how to push the image that was created by Spotify onto my personal mvpjava Docker Hub repository, which is a public repository. And you'll just have to remove the mvpjava if you're going to be using this code, and it could just be built locally. So we're going to see how to do that. Stay tuned for that. That's a little extra more at the end of the tutorial. And we'll end off with some outgoing points here and how to improve the application and where to go from here. Okay, so first things first, the application Spring Boot. You guys should know by now, if you've been following my channel, how to build a Spring Boot application. I have a nice video on Spring Boot, an introduction, and in fact, all it does really at the beginning is you go to the Spring Initializer website and you go off and you build and you download the application. All I did for this one was select the web component here, okay? So follow that tutorial if you really don't know how to bring a Spring Boot application. Next point is the actual application itself, all right? So the application itself is very simplistic, like I said. It's just a REST controller that has a mapping to the root context here / It gets mapped to the method, and we should see this string pop up in the browser if we've successfully deployed our war to our Tomcat server when we connect, let's say, with Firefox in this tutorial, okay? Now, if you're wondering why I'm extending Spring Boot Servlet Initializer, again, this has to do with the fact that we have no web.xml file, so this builder here, Spring Application Builder, is responsible for building the web.xml file if we would like something in there. I didn't put anything in there, but if you wanted to obviously add some filters or some interceptors, some mappings, all of that stuff can go in here, or you can go with your traditional web.xml file. So that's just a little extra there, not that we actually need that, okay? So if we go back to projects there, I just did a little boo-boo. Okay, there we go. I want to show you, first of all, my Dockerfile, and then we'll take a look at the Spotify Maven plugin inside our pom.xml file. So we've got our web application, right? It doesn't need to be complicated because if not, it's just we're going to lose track of what we're trying to do here, and that's just deploy it, okay, onto a container. So I'm using an official Tomcat base image here, and then I actually use volume/temp. What this is going to do, you don't actually need it for this particular web application because it's not really doing anything, but if you wanted to write to the file system, then what's going to happen is, by default, /temp is going to be mapped to your Docker host /var/lib/docker/volume in there. So it'll be persistent, okay, and you'll be able to write to that file system. The other thing is we're going to eventually copy our war file that we're going to build and package, and we're going to put it onto the Tomcat file system at the web apps deployment directory, okay? So then we're going to run a command, and we're going to touch the actual war file. And the reason for this is because when Spring Boot builds an application, it doesn't modify the modification timestamp or anything like that. So Tomcat's going to need to know that. And so that's why we're doing that, to give it a modification timestamp over there. And the entry point is the command that's going to execute as soon as you run the container. And we're using more of the exact format of this entry point here. So we're running a shell with a command, the Java command. You should be very familiar with that one. And here you can see here, just skip this for a second, and we're specifying the jar file that we have in the web apps directory. Okay. Now this stuff over here, you see that a lot in other tutorials here, but really what this guy is all about is that when Tomcat starts up, if in order to generate its session IDs and all the kind of things that are secure, it needs a certain level of randomness, and so it goes into a certain file here, usually in this path, and it's the random file, and it goes to get a certain level of entropy, right? And then with that, it's able to build some really secure session IDs and all the other stuff. But what happens is because Docker, the file system is a little different, or it hasn't matured very much, you're just kind of building it and destroying it after, is that there's not much randomness or entropy in there, so your session keys are not really secure. And it'll block until it gets a certain level of randomness. The urandom actually is a version that does not block, okay, to get that level of entropy needed for those session keys. So what this actually does is speed up the deployment of your application in Tomcat, or rather the boot up of Tomcat itself. So in this case here, we're not going to wait an extra couple of seconds every time we want to run the container. Okay, so there's our Dockerfile, and we're going to make reference to that inside the Spotify plugin that we have in here. You'll notice I also have a Docker Compose, the YAML file. I'm not going to cover Docker Compose in this tutorial, but I did put the equivalent of the Dockerfile in here for those that are already privy to Docker Compose, and I'll give you a little sneak peek on the command line in about a minute. And I'll extend the example for the next tutorial to use Docker Compose to orchestrate all the containers together. Because right now we really got only one container besides the Netbeans one, right? We have the container with Tomcat. So let's go take a look at our pom.xml file. That is where it all comes together. Okay, let me just minimize this output. Okay, so this is standard Spring Boot stuff. Shouldn't be anything special here, except for here. You really got to make sure that's a WAR file. Okay, because by default on the Spring Initializer website, it's jar. Okay, so if you don't, you don't select WAR on the website, no problem. You could just change it to WAR here. That's pretty much a non-issue. I got some properties here. Remember this one, Docker image prefix. I actually put that to mvpjava. That's going to be the name of that's my username repository on Docker Hub, and I'm going to be referencing this property in a second. The second thing you need to do besides the WAR here to actually deploy to a Tomcat remote server is over here. Now, once you get this file from Spring Boot Initializer, this is not going to be in there. You're going to have to put that in there, right? Provided. So all the dependencies will be provided by the container when we actually deploy it in there. There's going to be no conflicts between what Spring Boot provided and what the Tomcat container is going to provide later on down the pipe. Okay, so you really need to put that there. And then there's just another third point we're going to cover in about 2 seconds. Okay, over here we've got our com.spotify Maven plugin. And we have a whole bunch of configuration that we're going to cover right now. One is the image name. Okay, so the image name is obviously Spotify. Its reason for being is to build Docker images. So what it's going to need here is, in my case, Docker image prefix, which I said was the property mvpjava / and then the project artifact. So the project artifact is going to be something like Spring Boot, Docker, Tomcat. And that is the image that's going to get created. When you say something like Docker images on the command line, you'll see it pop up for the image name. Okay. Then you have the Docker directory. Now this is where it's really important because we're not telling Spotify to create the Docker file. We've created the Docker file already, like I just covered. So we're telling it it's in the source main Docker path. So if you take a look here, we're talking about this guy, this path over here. So let me go look at files. All right, let me plop that down here. You'll notice source main Docker. So I actually created this directory. Okay, so you got to go create that directory, and in there you create a Docker file, which is really simple in any IDE, just kind of new Docker file. It's actually underneath the other if you want to go get it. This is just in the cache. It's already there for me. Okay, and you can actually also create a YAML file and do Docker Compose. Okay, so this is a very important directory, like I covered in the last tutorial, right? Because anything you put in here, it becomes your Docker context. Now all the files in here get copied over to the Docker directory and the target directory later on. So it's the same thing as if you would have done this on the command line, like when we built the Netbeans IDE container where we had a special empty directory with a Dockerfile in there, and then we built the Dockerfile. Okay, we built the container from the Dockerfile and its directory content. Okay, the third point, which is very important, is the Docker host. By default, it's going to be localhost and then the port number. Since this IDE is running inside a container, right? The Docker host is not running in this container. It's running on the Linux host. So I have to actually make reference to the IP address that's actually running the Docker host. Now that's not a problem, because this is the same thing we did when in the last tutorial I showed you how to go to services, and I said if you wanted to set up the Docker, when you say add Docker, you'd have to know the IP address of your Docker host. This is the exact same thing. If you forget, this is really like an environmental variable for Spotify to properly build your image. Okay. Then we got some tags here. I want to actually, when I build an image, I want to force the tag to be overwritten every time, and you can have one or more image tags that are produced. So my image tag, I want it to have the project version appended to it. So the project version, I think, is just 1.0 over here. Okay, and I also want the latest tag over there. Now this is an extra here. Check this guy out here. What's going to happen here is if I want, I can actually push the Docker image once it's created to my Docker Hub account. Okay, so I specify the registry URL, and then the server ID is actually going to get mapped to an ID that I've set up with Maven over here in settings.xml. This is just a template file, but if I look at what I actually modified, you'll notice that the server ID, this is the same one I just made reference to. There's my username, there's my encrypted password, there's my email address. Okay, so I'm actually going to show you guys how to encrypt your Maven passwords in another tutorial. Okay, but anyways, by the time you get access to the source code, that password will be removed. Okay, so you won't be able to, the bad guys out there won't be able to corrupt my Docker Hub repository. But you know, I trust everyone on the channel, no worries. Okay, so pom.xml file, that'll push to the Docker Hub registry, but you don't want that every time. That takes a long time. You kind of just want to do that when you want to publish the whole thing. So you can actually map Docker commands in Spotify to Maven goals. Okay, in order to do so, you can do it with these flags here, like -d push that I'll show you in a second. You can push the image, or you can skip to push the image. Okay, hey, there's my cat making noise again. Let me get her out of the way, and we'll continue. It's so crazy. Every time I make a video, she has to come and meow her way in here. Okay, so like I was saying, we can actually push to the repository or not push. So we're gonna have a flag to do this because it's super time consuming. We kind of only want to do what we know, and we're sure that we want to push it out there. Okay, there is another way to do it. To actually, like I said, binding the Docker commands to specific Maven goals in some executions, and then underneath that execution tags. But it's actually a little bit verbose, I find, for the tutorial. So I opted to do it this way, which I'm going to show you in a second. All right, and now on to the good stuff too, is the resources. Okay, so what's going to happen here is we're going to be including the WAR file that we're going to be generating. So the WAR file is going to comprise of the artifact ID / the version number, and we're going to get it from the build directory, which is the target directory, and we're going to copy it to this target path. Now this is one's a little, I don't know if it's confusing, but it needs some clarification. What's going to happen, okay, when we're going to run this, is you're going to see that it's going to take everything under the Docker directory and the WAR file that it's going to build, okay? It's going to copy it after to the target directory inside the Docker directory. So you notice this is like Docker directory is identical to this one. Copy everything over and the WAR file. So this slash here is not actually target slash, it's target Docker slash. So you can actually change that if you wanted to, but I like just leaving it like that as slash. Okay, so without further ado, let's build this bad boy and see what's going on. Now what I did is, instead of going on the command line back and forth, I just put the commands in here. So you're gonna always want to clean this to make sure you get everything perfect. You're gonna package it, And then we're going to use Docker build. So that's going to be from the Spotify plugin. Now, I don't want to push the image right away. I'll leave that for the end of the tutorial. I want to skip the Docker push. Okay, so let's see how this looks like when I do this. Off it goes, obviously cleaning everything it has to do, running any tests that it finds. In this case, there is actually no tests that need to be run. Packaging the application. And you can see here the Spring logo. Everything's coming up. And now it's going to actually build the image. You can see the image, the layers being built. You can see the tagging happening. And you can see the image ID coming out. And you'll see here that, again, mvpjava is the username on the repository. There we have our image real name with the tag 1.0 and latest, like I had in the tags element there. Over here, you'll notice the copying, right? Again, it goes from the target directory, like I said, to the target Docker /. Okay, so our war file is getting copied there, Dockerfile, Docker compose YAML file, and now we're good to go. Okay, so if we go on the command line, right, and I say Docker and images, we should see here that we have this one over here 57 seconds ago and the one with the latest tag as well. So now we're good to go. We can actually go in here and say Docker. Actually, I might have this in memory. I don't want to have to do this all over again. Docker run. It might actually be better if I go from the home directory. Alright, so Docker run, right? I want this to be removed after it's run. So once I stop it, I'm going to call it the container Docker war, and I'm mapping to port 8080. Now those ports have already been exposed in the original image. Okay, so that's why you didn't see me in my own Dockerfile exposing it. And I want to run this in the background. And that is the name that I'm using for my Tomcat container. So obviously it's going to default to latest, but I could say latest here, or I could say 1.0 here. It doesn't really matter. So I get the name returned back to me, the Docker ID of the container. So if I say Docker PS right now, you'll actually see that it's up and we're good to go. Now, what I recommend in this case, right, is you can actually say Docker. We want to execute a command and we get an interactive terminal and we put the name of the container, which right now is Docker war, and we just want to open up a shell in there and we just want to look at what the IP address is, right? So it's 172.17.03. Okay, so we go over here and we say 172.17.03. That's what it was. And then we said we were exposing port 8080. And there we go. We got our Spring Boot War deployment in Tomcat Docker container successful. That's that string that I had in the home method, right? So boom, we have what we need right now. And if ever you wanted to, again, check, let's say the logs, right? You can just say Docker logs, and it's called Docker War. That's the name of the container. Docker. Oh yeah, I'm in the shell. I gotta get out of here. Yeah. I keep doing that mistake. I keep forgetting I'm inside the container. You got to be on the host to do something like that, right? Docker war. There you go. You got your logs sticking out there. That's if you didn't run it with the -d, then you wouldn't have to do this. But I don't like to see my process to hang. I like to actually put it in the background. So now if I again do Docker PS just to make sure if it's still running, right? I'm gonna actually say Docker stop. I don't want this guy running anymore. Right? Docker war. Stop this guy. It usually takes a couple of seconds to properly shut it down because we're not doing like a force or a kill or anything like that. And then when it's properly shut down, we can just make sure that it's not there anymore. Now, again, you could have done this through Netbeans like I showed you in another tutorial, right? Because you have access to these containers in here and these images, and you can just go, start and stop and all that kind of stuff in there, okay? So now that we have everything kind of sorted out, let me show you how you would go about it with actually pushing this, right? So you can actually say -d push image now. And what's going to happen is the exact same thing is going to happen, but this time at the end, it's going to actually push it to my public repository on Docker Hub. All right, so you'll see at the end here, it's still building it, right? Everything's good. And then after the tagging, boom, you see here that we're going online and we're doing this. So if I actually bring up Firefox again on the Docker Hub, this is my mvpjava Docker Hub account, you'll see that it actually got in here from a previous run that I did. So this is the same thing is going to happen. It's going to take a little bit more time because I'm doing it live. But then now you guys will be able to pull it and actually play with the tutorial. Okay, so off it goes, right? It's actually going to take probably a couple more, maybe another minute or something like that. So if we go back to the outline here, we've covered everything here. Okay, we've deployed a web application on a remote Tomcat server. I showed you the 3 points you needed for that. Okay, we did it from another container. Okay, so we needed the Docker host environment variable that had in the pom.xml file. We took a look at the Spotify Maven plugin by using a Dockerfile, and I also showed you how to push that to the registry. Now, in terms of outgoing points, it's for sure that there's a lot of room for improvement, okay, for this example. But this example is there kind of as a step up, a progression on where to go from the last tutorial. You see here that everything got created fine. So last tutorial, like I said, was building the environment, the developer environment in a container. This one got a little bit further in terms of development and deploying into a container. The next step we're going to have to do is create another container like a database to interact with Tomcat. Okay, and then we want to orchestrate the whole thing together, so we don't have to, sit there and execute a whole bunch of Docker run commands for Tomcat, Docker run commands, let's say for MongoDB, all this kind of stuff. We want to orchestrate that in a Docker Compose file. That's the whole point of a Docker Compose file, is it will orchestrate the whole thing. And like I said, this one here, I just did it so you wouldn't have to do it from the command line with the Docker run. So if I actually, let's for fun, let's just do it right now. Let's go to my workspaces. Where did I put? I put in Netbeans. I know this path. Then let's go to the project. It's called Tomcat. Let's go to the target directory. And there should be a Docker directory in there. And now if you say something like Docker Compose up, right? Let me run it in the background. That's all you need to do. You don't have to do run -p and all these other flags, minus name. You can actually just do Docker PS now, and it's up again. And go find what the IP is, like I showed you before, and you can just run the application. So that's a very small sneak peek at what Docker Compose does. You could imagine if you had many containers, how this is a lifesaver in terms of time. Okay, so you can do it both ways, but I'll only explain all this kind of stuff in the next tutorial. Like I said, it was just there as a convenience, and especially for those who already know how to use Docker Compose, that's pretty cool. Okay, so the other outgoing point is we obviously can improve on integrating more with the tools online, like in continuous integration environment where we have Git online and Jenkins and using more of these web hooks to orchestrate the whole thing. So that I acknowledge, I know that this tutorial doesn't cover that, but I did that on purpose because it's too much of a chunk to take in one time. So we're going to progressively get there. So make sure you come back for the other tutorials because little by little you will get there. Okay, so if you haven't subscribed, do it now so you can get notified of those videos when they come out. All right, and I'll also cover Docker Compose on the next video. So that's pretty much it, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please leave a like or share. And until next time, I'll be here preparing the next one. Cheers.